This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
I have no tears left, for they have become the ink of my misfortunes. Emir al-Mutamid of Seville, 1091. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history, warts and all, unabashedly and unashamed. Now, we're well into our Bend 7 of our medieval story here, and we've just wrapped up a miniseries about the fallout of the death of William the Conqueror and how his three sons picked up the pieces dropped by his passing. Staying in Bend 7, a chapter in our story called All Roads Lead to Clermont, we're shifting south of England, south of Normandy, and even south of France itself. We're crossing the Pyrenees Mountains into Iberia once again to catch up on things there in a two-part miniseries called Iberia on the Eve of Crusade. If you remember, we spent quite a bit of time detailing the catastrophic collapse of the Cordoba Caliphate earlier in the century, the quote-unquote scattered pearls that were the Taifa states, and the inevitable pushback from the Christian kingdoms in the far north of the peninsula. Ultimately, we landed on Spain's national hero, Rodrigo Diaz, known in legend and lore as the incomparable El Cid. Well, this little mini-series here will check in once again and lay out what Iberia looked like on the eve of the First Crusade. We're picking up in the early 1090s, but instead of following El Cid, we'll be seeing the peninsula's story from different angles this time. This may be the eve of the First Crusade, but it's also the beginning of what would be called Reconquista, a centuries-long struggle between Christians and Muslims for supremacy, a centuries-long battle for what amounts to one of two major inroads in and out of Europe. Iberia is far more important to our Western story than many may realize. Now, before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording for as low as just $1 per month. We have full series covering stories such as Poland's rise through the 11th century and our current ongoing series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. Also, an extra quick note about our Fortune's Wheel YouTube page. Yeah, we have one of those. Actually, we've had it for a few years, but man, YouTube, that's a whole thing. And I finally set it up, backfilled all of our episodes, even organized them into playlists. Pretty cool stuff. So if you're interested, head over to YouTube and show some support there. Even if you don't use it to listen to the show, a simple like and subscribe goes a long way for podcasts like this one. Hope to see some of you over there. Now this is episode 155 entitled End of the Taifa Era. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Yusuf ibn Tashfin. Now that's a name we haven't heard on the show in quite a while. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was the leader of the Almoravids, founded in the 1050s as a coalition of various Berber tribes in what is today Mauritania and Western Sahara. They rapidly moved across the region, taking control over modern-day Morocco. In fact, it was even the Almoravids who founded the famous city of Marrakesh in the 1070s. Their leaders never took the title of caliph, instead choosing the title Amir al-Muslimin, which is translated as Prince of Muslims. It's also where the English gets the word emir, and by not taking the title of caliph, they were acknowledging a caliph elsewhere. But where? Next door in Egypt? The Fatimids caliph? No, that would just be too easy. The Almoravids actually frog-jumped the Fatimids altogether and recognized the overlordship of the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad. In this small detail, we find immense depth with which to understand the fundamental schism within Islam itself. The Fatimids in Egypt, they were Shia, while the Abbasids in Baghdad were Sunni. The Almoravids, while not its own caliphate, recognized their place within Sunni Islam. It seems that in the 11th century, the Fatimids were enclosed within their own little bubble inside a larger Sunni majority across the Middle East and North Africa. That will come into play in just a few years here. Now, having swept North Africa and down the Atlantic seaboard, past the mighty Sahara, toward even the greener savannas, the Almoravids were invited to help stem the rising tide of Christian conquest in Iberia. The softer Muslims in Iberia, again the remnants of the powerful and sophisticated Cordoba Caliphate, well, these softer Muslims were in no shape to control these wilder Berbers from across the Strait of Gibraltar. The Almoravids came across, laid a beat down to the Christians, and thankfully for all Iberians, scooted off back home shortly after. However, they had seen Iberia for what it was, a broken and fractured land of weak Islam in what they saw as an even weaker Christian region to reclaim. The Almoravids returned to Iberia in the 1080s, and what resulted was a resounding victory at Zaragoza on October 23, 1085. We outlined this in depth on the show previously. But even after this, Yusuf ibn Tashfin took his Almoravid army back across Africa again, most likely because his son and heir, Sir ibn Yusuf, had been killed. The disorder needed to be addressed ASAP, otherwise he would have lost his entire home base of Morocco. Now, King Alfonso VI, having been bruised and beaten and sent retreating back north after the humiliating defeat at Zaragoza, well, he collected himself again and his forces and pushed deeper south into Muslim Iberia. However, as was endemic with the Muslim Taifa kingdoms in the 11th century, the rulers of Murcia and Seville were embroiled in their own prideful row, and they were unable to handle this Christian army. The elites, not the Taifa rulers necessarily, were the ones who reached out to Ibn Tashfin once again. By mid-spring 1088, the Almoravids were back in Iberia. Watching the Almoravids during the 1080s was like watching the tennis ball itself during some, crazy rally. Seeing the internecine infighting within the Muslim states, Ibn Tashfin was forced by November of that same year, 1088, to return once again to Africa. The dysfunction was just too much for him to try to deal with and to navigate through. Again, these Taifas were weak and ineffective and far too prideful to lay down their small differences and stand together, united in Islam, against the encroaching Christians. It sickened him to witness the lavish courts, the personal zoos, the grand palaces and integrated societies consisting of not only Muslims, but also high-ranking Jews and even Christians as well. Ibn Tashfin was a hardliner. Islam had no space for weakness. He was born under the harsh Saharan sun, and he was known to be clad in court, as well as on the battlefield, in a simple woolen robe. It's gotta be uncomfortable. He rode at the head of his army and had absolutely no inclination for the comforts of court. An anonymous chronicler in Al-Andalus, remember that was the name the Muslims had for Iberia, Well, this chronicler left us the following about the leader of the Almoravids. Quote, Yusuf, the emir of the Muslims, beheld Al-Andalus, and his heart burned at its weakness, its people lost in luxuries, unprepared for war. End quote. Now, as far as he was concerned, he had made how many treks across the 7-mile Strait of Gibraltar to save these pansies, even snatching a major victory for Islam at Zaragoza? Crushing King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile was no small feat, and people never forgot that. After putting things in order in North Africa once again, Yusuf ibn Tashfin decided to return to Al-Andalus. But this, he determined, would be a different sort of visit. Ibn Tashfin wouldn't come as an ally to his co-religionists in the Taifa kingdoms. Instead, he would come as a conqueror.
Experience a progressive lens engineered with AI from Essilor, powered by individual measurements of your visual behavior. A lens personalized to you by an Essilor expert. Discover Verilux XR Track and enjoy instantly sharp vision in motion and seamless transitions from near to far. Find your local Essilor expert today at Essilor.com.
In a way, it ends where it begins.
Very insightful.
Thank you for sharing this Red Baron with us, Linda. It's so tasty, it makes me want to share something of my own. I didn't actually read the book.
Me neither.
I watched the movie last night.
I judged it by its cover.
I haven't read a book since middle school.
I'm secretly seeing 2 other book clubs.
And I can't even read.
I'm not really Gary. He just paid me to be here. Sharing Red Baron pizza can lead to more sharing.
Now, by the 1080s, the fractured Taifa kingdoms, those scattered pearls of the once mighty Cordoba Caliphate, while wealthy, and they were very wealthy, they were in no position to be talking trash to anyone else, Christian or otherwise. Though incredibly rich still, such as Al-Mutamid of Seville and Abd Allah of Granada, they relied heavily on Christian mercenaries, and when those Christian mercs began amassing into armies from their own kingdoms, well, these wealthy Taifa kings turned to the Almoravids more and more, as we've just seen. When these Almoravids kept coming back and forth across the strait, they started to see the forest for the trees, and these trees, they were weak and dying. Maybe not on the outside, but trees often hide their true issues beneath their bark and beautiful foliage. The Almoravids, like the Christians before them, knew these Taifas for what they were, ineffectual and doomed. The Christian kingdoms up north, specifically Leon and Castile, already struck while the iron was hot, and though a little behind, the Almoravids too decided to strike. And it wasn't just an opportunity for expansion that presented itself. Yusuf ibn Tashfin viewed an invasion of the Taifas as something much bigger and deeper than mere conquest. Ibn Tashfin viewed his final invasion and conquest as a cleansing of Islam itself. The decadence of the Taifas was a betrayal of Islam, in his opinion anyway. Ibn Tashfin received a fatwa, or a legal ruling, from North African jurists stating that it was his solemn duty to overthrow them in the name of cleansing Islam of its weaker elements, especially since those weaker elements were on the frontier borders with a rival religion. A pretty powerful one, and growing increasingly so. Ibn Tashfin was, in essence, burning away the deadwood. He was separating the wheat from the chaff, as they say. Again, the Almoravid conquest of Al-Andalus was a cleansing. In retrospect, the aforementioned Abd Allah of Granada lamented his repeated appeals to the Almoravids to help them fight the Christians. He himself once wrote, quote, "I called them to save us from the Christians, but they came to take everything from us." End quote. The Almoravid conquest, beginning in the late 1080s, was the ultimate FAFO moment for the scattered pearls of Cordoba. Now, the first to fall was the same Abd Allah's Granada in 1090. By this time, Granada was by far one of the most vulnerable of the remaining Taifa kingdoms in Al-Andalus. Its ruler had inherited a precarious situation. See, his grandfather, Badis ibn Habus, had once ruled over a powerful Zirid Taifa. But by the time Abd-Allah came to power in 1073, Granada was hemmed in by enemies on all sides. His most dangerous threat, however, would come from within Islam itself. The Christians were quickly made secondary as the most pressing issues facing Granada. The Almoravid military machine, as was already on full display at Sagrajas years earlier against King Alfonso, well, it was a juggernaut, especially by 1090. It just kept growing. They were a well-oiled machine by this time, and with a mission of cleansing Islam itself, it became something driven with a higher purpose, you could say, which is always dangerous. Keep that in mind as we near the First Crusade. Hint, hint. These were battle-hardened Berber warriors from the Maghreb, accustomed to much harsher desert warfare than the already deadly desert-like conditions of those southern parts of Iberia. Their tight discipline and religious zeal contrasted starkly with the decadent courts of Iberia, where silk-robed emirs composed poetry, feasted heartily, and played chess while relying on Christian mercs to fight in their stead. A 13th century scholar, Ibn Idhara, wrote about this period, describing the difference between the two forces. Quote, "The warriors of Yusuf ibn Tashfin were hardened by the sands of the Maghreb, their bodies lean from hardship, their hearts purified by faith. The Taifa kings, by contrast, lounged in their perfumed halls, trusting in gold rather than the strength of their swords." End quote. While Andalusi emirs dined in vast halls, bathed in rose-infused water, and wore exotic silks from 1,000 miles away, while this was happening, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, as I mentioned earlier, was known as a pretty simple man. He ate dates and lamb and drank only water. He wore a plain woolen cloak. Yeah, wool in the desert. His eyes held a permanent squint from decades in the North Saharan sun, and his skin was rough from the near-constant pelting of sand against his face, hands, and arms. He wore deep and well-earned wrinkles across his face. The Almoravid cavalry was one of the strongest forces in the medieval Islamic world, arguably behind only the Normans in southern Italy and Sicily. They were light, fast-moving, and sported a devastating range of hit-and-run tactics. Its archers were disciplined on horseback or foot. Its spearmen held their lines in the face of oncoming enemies, and they fought bravely until they either fell or emerged victorious. There was no other outcome. Almoravid spearmen were not known to retreat. Unlike Taifa armies, which were often undisciplined and disorganized and, again, reliant on mercs, the Almoravids fought as a cohesive unit, guided by strict religious principles. And what the Almoravids brought to Iberia was something rarely seen since the first decades of the Cordoba Caliphate, more than 200 years earlier. Certainly no one alive in the 1080s remembered ever seeing such a devastating force, which includes the forces led by both legends King Alfonso VI and El Cid. And with this immensely powerful force, Ibn Tashfin set his sights on Granada itself first. In the autumn of 1090, Abd-Allah heard of the Almoravids crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, and it immediately struck him as a threat because, well, so far as he knew, nobody invited the Almoravids this time. According to Abd-Allah's own memoirs written many years later while in exile, quote, "I was caught between two fires. Should I resist and perish, or submit and betray my people?" End quote. Now, on behalf of himself and Granada itself, he tried to negotiate with Ibn Tashfin, but the Almoravid leader was in absolutely no mood for negotiations. Ibn Tashfin ignored the pleas for a meeting and simply surrounded the city, quickly cutting off its supply lines. There was absolutely nothing Abd-Allah could do. Granada fell with almost no resistance, but it was the city's people who surrendered, and not the emir. Yusuf ibn Tashfin simply walked unopposed into the city and deposed Emir Abd-Allah without delay. This happened with such simplicity and swiftness that the story echoed far and wide. It marked a very real change in the winds of history, especially in that part of the world. In a word, it was shocking. You'll never guess who wrote the following, quote, "With hardly the drawing of a sword, Granada was taken. The so-called king, who had once sat in his halls in splendor, now stood in the dust before his conqueror." End quote. Orderic Vitalis actually wrote that. The fall of Granada to the Almoravids in 1090, within just a couple of decades, was a well-documented event as far north as Normandy. Now, as for Abd Allah, Ibn Tashfin chose to keep the man's head on his shoulders. Abd Allah was sent into exile, as I said before, but not just anywhere. He was exiled to Morocco, where he could be kept under close watch. The man grew old in obscurity, stripped of his kingdom and all its luxury and trappings. He composed not just one memoir, but a series of them. Arguably one of his most famous passages is also one of the most heartbreaking from the period. Quote, "I weep for my lost kingdom, yet it was I who let it slip through my fingers. My sins, weaknesses, my hesitation, these were the chains that bound me long before Yusuf placed me in exile." End quote. This passage became emblematic for the rest of the Taifa kingdoms as they fell, one by one, to the mighty Almoravids. Now, the Almoravids, after Granada, moved around southern Al-Andalus, taking one Taifa after another, slowly creeping its way closer and closer to the last major Taifa in the region, Seville. But the Almoravids were hesitating. It certainly wasn't out of fear, for the Almoravids feared no mortal, at least such was their reputation. They hesitated because of who led Seville at the time. Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abad. Under Al-Mu'tamid, Seville had become a cultural and economic jewel of Al-Andalus, a center for poetry, philosophy, and trade. Al-Mu'tamid was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in Muslim Iberia. He could prove to be useful to Ibn Tashfin if he played his cards right. But being such a man, Al-Mu'tamid would have to be worn down a little before he was approached directly. The tactic of taking over smaller taifas around Seville proved to show the emir that he was quickly losing his standing and his bases of support. Besides, Al-Mu'tamid was once the most enthusiastic of all the Taifa emirs when it came to inviting the Almoravids over, so that enthusiasm could be leveraged. Now, regarding the Almoravids coming over in 1086, resulting in the defeat, again, of King Alfonso VI, the 12th century chronicler Ibn al-Khatib wrote, quote, "Al-Mu'tamid, seeing the fire of the Christians spreading, invited Yusuf ibn Tashfin to extinguish it. But he did not foresee that the flame he summoned would consume him as well." End quote. And what happened next is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to truly express the politics of Iberia in the late 11th century. Now, like El Cid, who followed the money, fighting for the Muslims against his Christian brethren and immediately switching to fight for the Christians against his former Muslim allies, well, like El Cid, Al-Mu'tamid, who had lost Toledo to King Alfonso VI years earlier, he now contacted King Alfonso for help against the very Almoravids who he had called over to defeat him years earlier. Though religion was a major component of what was happening in Iberia throughout the 11th century, I would caution everyone from thinking it was the driving motivation for all involved. After Toledo and after the Battle of Sagrajas, for instance, Al-Mu'tamid was still paying King Alfonso a hefty tribute. Now, he was also begging on-again, off-again Christian frenemy to move his army south to help save Seville from his encroaching co-religionists. It may have been the driving force, religion, for the Almoravids, but that could not be said for the Taifas in the region. But Alfonso, he just couldn't help at the moment. Not in 1090. The Almoravids were sending advanced forces north and testing the borderlands pretty frequently. Alfonso just couldn't commit any extra troops to save Seville. It was as if, for the time being, Alfonso was giving Seville up. So it was in early 1091, Ibn Tashfin sent his most skilled and feared general, a man named Sir Ibn Abu Bakr, straight to Seville to begin a siege of the large city. Sir also led a number of assaults testing the city's defenses as well. The Almoravids encircled the city, cut off the trade and supplies and reinforcements to the city immediately. By summer, Seville had grown quite hungry and people and animals began dying right there in the streets. Fear rose to a fever pitch by late July, and by late August 1091, Seville was a relative ghost town as famine had struck the starved city. Al-Mutamid, once a man of the arts, now found himself preparing for war, still having a formidable army within the walls. But unlike the Almoravid forces, his forces were undermined by internal divisions, lack of discipline, and the laxness cultivated by a reliance on foreign mercenaries. What need of internal discipline was there when others were paid to do your fighting for you? A self-inflated ego is the enemy of any fighting man. By August, the outer fortifications of Seville began to crumble. The city couldn't withstand much more of the almost daily onslaught from the Almoravids outside. A contemporary historian and eyewitness named Ibn Bassam wrote, quote, "The walls of Seville shuddered beneath the fury of the Berbers, and within, the people despaired, for they knew the end was near." End quote. After months of crippling siege warfare, the Almoravids at last breached the city in mid-September. They stormed the Alcazar, the royal palace, capturing Emir al-Mutamid and his entire family. His soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, offered little resistance in the final hours and minutes. What could they do against such a powerful force anyway? The city, once a center of Andalusian culture, was now at the mercy of these dirty desert dwellers. Al-Mutamid, having held out for so long, for reaching out to Christians for assistance, and for raising his army against the Almoravids, well, Al-Mutamid was imprisoned for the rest of his life in a miserable Agmat prison back in Morocco. One thing that Al-Mutamid never lost was his sense of the poetic. He was a poet above all else, and he was still allowed to be one in captivity, leaving some of the most haunting Andalusi poetry to history. Chronicler Ibn Bassam wrote of him, quote, "In Seville, he was a king among kings. In Agmat, he was a prisoner among prisoners. But his words, though forged in chains, still held the grandeur of a monarch." End quote. One of Al-Mutamid's most haunting verses was this, quote, "I am content to be a captive, for I once was a king who gave gold to his poets, and now I am one who weeps in his chains." End quote. And with the fall of mighty Seville, much like the fall of the mighty Harold Hardrada way up north back in 1066, this marked the end of a centuries-long era. With the fall of Seville, the last major independent Taifa kingdom, history marks the end of the Taifa period. It's worth saying out loud, the Taifa period was not ended by Christians. The Taifa period was ended by Muslims from North Africa. The Almoravids now ruled Al-Andalus, and an overhaul was set to sweep the region. Almoravids immediately embarked on the cleansing they had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to impose. Strict religious orthodoxy, the elimination of luxurious courtly culture, and a hard line toward the Christian kingdoms in the north, as well as those Jews and Christians who had been welcomed and integrated into Andalusi communities for centuries. As for the Christian kingdoms in the north, namely Leon Castile, as this kingdom was the biggest beneficiary and benefactor of those taifas, such as Seville, it seems they were hard hit as well. For starters, King Alfonso no longer received those hefty tributes he'd enjoyed for a number of years. Without these funds, they would be forced to seek other revenue streams, even those from Rome itself. Over the next 2 years, between 1092 and 1094, the Almoravids consolidated their power in the south, while sending those same raiding parties north to the borderlands to continue to stress test the Christians at every turn. They've conquered their co-religionists and imposed their own flavor of Sunni Islam there. But opposing the Christian enemies as an established regime was a new kind of warfare for them. But as they settled in, Yusuf ibn Tashfin realized the closest and smallest city and region he could test a conquest on also happened to be led by the peninsula's most formidable warrior, that living legend, El Cid. Regardless, Ibn Tashfin decided to cut his teeth on El Cid's Valencia. But that's a story for another time. For now, suffice it to say that as 1091 turned to 1092, Iberia itself had once again changed forever. The era of Taifas was over, and a new age of strict, fundamental Sunni rule had begun. The Christian kingdoms of Leon and Castile, as well as Aragon, were no longer able to manipulate the Taifa rulers, forcing them to instantly redevelop their foreign policy strategies, reorganize their economies in the absence of vast sums of money coming in from Taifa payments, and to re-engage friends and opponents alike seeking alliances elsewhere. But in the wider world, momentous events were stirring. On the next episode, we watch the Almoravids just keep rolling north. But they have to run out of steam at some point, right? Right? Either way, make no mistake, what happens in Iberia directly informs and drives what happens in the coming years. And this is that story. Until next time.